Standing at my own kitchen window, watching strangers load flowers into a hearse parked in my driveway, I realized my stepson Ethan had just made the biggest mistake of his 28 years. Real family only, Margaret, he'd said an hour earlier, his girlfriend Ashley nodding beside him like some vindictive bobblehead. Not gold diggers who married dying men for money. The irony was so thick, I could have cut it with the sterling silver cake server Richard had given me for our 10th wedding anniversary, the one Ethan assumed he'd inherit along with everything else. What they didn't know, what none of them knew as they bustled around my home making funeral arrangements without me, was that I held the only legal will. The document they'd been waving around like a victory flag, a photocopy of something Richard had written 15 years ago before we met, before everything changed. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a 62-year-old widow learned that sometimes the most devastating revenge is simply letting people destroy themselves with their own greed and stupidity. I met Richard Blackwood when I was 55 and he was 63, both of us carrying the particular brand of loneliness that comes from losing your first spouse too young. I was Ashley Green then, 7 years widowed from my first husband Frederick, working as a real estate paralegal at Henderson and Associates. Richard came in needing help transferring property after his mother's death, this tall, distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes who looked completely overwhelmed by legal paperwork. "I don't understand half of what they're asking for," he'd said, sliding a folder across my desk with the defeated gesture of someone who'd rather be anywhere else. "My son Ethan says I should just let him handle it, but honestly, Margaret, may I call you Margaret? I don't think he understands it any better than I do." That should have been my first warning about Ethan, but I was too charmed by Richard's old-world courtesy, the way he actually stood when I entered the room, how he insisted on walking me to my car after our first dinner date. Here was a man who opened doors and pulled out chairs, who brought me gardenias because he'd noticed them in my garden, who listened when I talked about Frederick without that glazed look most men got when widows mentioned their dead husbands. Ethan, on the other hand, made his feelings clear from our very first meeting. Richard had invited me to Sunday dinner at his house, this beautiful colonial with the wraparound porch where I'd end up spending the happiest 7 years of my life, and Ethan arrived with Ashley, both of them dressed like they were attending a shareholders meeting rather than a family meal. "So you work for lawyers," Ethan had said, making it sound like I stripped for truckers. "That must be interesting." The pause before interesting was loaded with enough contempt to sink a battleship. Ashley, blonde and 26 to Ethan's 21 at the time, had smiled with the kind of sweetness that immediately put me on guard. "Oh, how nice that you have a career to fall back on," she'd said in that breathy, syrupy tone I'd come to despise. "So many women your age struggle after losing their husbands." I should have recognized the territorial marking right then, the way she positioned herself between Richard and me during dinner, how she kept referring to "when Ethan and I have children," while patting his arm possessively. But I was 55 years old and in love for the second time in my life, willing to overlook a lot for the sake of Richard's happiness. The next 7 years were a masterclass in subtle warfare. Ashley, who'd moved in with Ethan 6 months after that dinner, had an uncanny ability to schedule family emergencies every time Richard and I planned something special. She'd call during our anniversary dinners with tearful stories about Ethan needing his father right now, about how much it would mean if Richard could just come over for a little while. "She's young," Richard would say apologetically, already reaching for his coat. "She doesn't understand that when you're a parent, you never stop being needed." I bit my tongue so many times during those years, I'm surprised I had any tongue left. But I understood something about Richard that his son and girlfriend never grasped. He was a man who'd rather be taken advantage of than risk hurting someone he loved. It was both his greatest strength and his most exploitable weakness. The house incident started small. Ashley would rearrange my things when she visited, just enough to show she considered herself more at home there than I was. She'd move my coffee mug from its usual spot in the cupboard, switch my reading glasses to a different table, reorganize my spice rack to be more efficient. "I was just trying to help," she'd say with wounded innocence whenever I mentioned it. "I thought you'd appreciate someone taking initiative around here." But it was Ethan who escalated things to true psychological warfare. He had this way of questioning every financial decision Richard and I made together, always framed as loving concern for his father's welfare. "Dad, are you sure you want to refinance the house just so Margaret can renovate the kitchen?" he'd ask during what I thought were casual family dinners. "I mean, at your age, shouldn't you be thinking about preserving assets rather than spending them? Or, I notice Margaret's name is on the mortgage now. Is that really wise? What happens if something goes wrong?" Richard would get this trapped look on his face, caught between loyalty to me and the son who'd been guilting him since childhood, because that was Ethan's specialty, emotional manipulation disguised as filial devotion. He'd learned early that being the only child of a devoted father meant he could leverage love like a weapon. The real trouble started when Richard was diagnosed with stage 3 lung cancer. He'd been a smoker in his 20s and 30s, quit 40 years ago, but the damage was already done. The doctors gave him 18 months with treatment, maybe 2 years if we were lucky. I'll never forget the day we got the diagnosis. Richard sat in the oncologist's office holding my hand so tightly I thought he might break my fingers, both of us trying to process words like aggressive and metastasized and palliative care. When we got home, I made tea with shaking hands while he called Ethan. "Son, I need you to come over," Richard had said, his voice steady despite everything. "Margaret and I have something important to tell you." Ethan and Ashley arrived within an hour, both of them with that sharp, alert look people get when they sense opportunity in tragedy. They sat on the couch across from us, our couch in our living room, and listened as Richard explained his diagnosis with the same careful courtesy he brought to everything else. "I'm sorry, Dad," Ethan said, but his eyes were already calculating. "This must be so scary for both of you. Have you thought about what this means for your affairs? I mean, practically speaking?" I watched Ashley squeeze Ethan's hand encouragingly, both of them leaning forward like vultures who'd just spotted roadkill. This was their moment, the chance they'd been waiting for through 7 years of pretending to tolerate me. "We'll cross those bridges when we come to them," Richard said firmly. "Right now, I just want to focus on treatment and spending time with the people I love." But Ethan wasn't about to let it go. "Dad, I think we need to be realistic here. You're going to need care, real care, and Margaret—" He looked at me with barely disguised pity. "No offense, Margaret, but you're not exactly a spring chicken yourself. Are you really equipped to handle what's coming?" The patronizing concern in his voice made my teeth ache. At 59, I was hardly decrepit, but Ethan had always had a talent for making me feel ancient and incapable. It was Ashley who delivered the killing blow, though. "We've been talking," she said, that sugary voice dripping with false compassion, "and we think it might be best if Richard moved in with us during his treatment. We have that spare room, and I could take care of him properly. It would be so much easier than expecting Margaret to manage everything on her own." I felt something cold and hard settle in my chest, like a stone dropping into still water. This was it, the moment I'd been dreading for 7 years. They were making their move, trying to separate Richard from me when he was most vulnerable, positioning themselves as the loving family while painting me as the inadequate second wife who couldn't handle the responsibility. Richard's response surprised all of us. "Absolutely not," he said, his voice carrying the same quiet authority he'd used in 40 years of running his consulting business. "Place is here with my wife in our home. Margaret has been my partner through everything, and she'll be my partner through this too." The look that flashed between Ethan and Ashley could have lit fires. They'd overplayed their hand, pushed too hard too fast, and now they knew they'd have to wait for Richard to get sicker, more dependent, before they could try again. But that was when they started getting creative. It began with the helpful visits. Ashley would stop by every few days, just to check on things, arriving with casseroles I never asked for and staying to reorganize whatever caught her attention. She'd clean out our medicine cabinet, rearrange our kitchen cabinets, even reorder our mail into what she called a more logical system. "I just want to make things easier for you both," she'd say when I protested. "You have so much to worry about with Richard's treatment." Ethan took a different approach. He started questioning every medical decision Richard and I made together, insisting on attending doctor appointments and speaking directly to oncologists as if I weren't in the room. He'd pull doctors aside to ask private questions about his father's care, then report back to Richard with his own interpretations of what the doctors really meant. "Dr. Peterson says the treatment is more aggressive than he usually recommends for someone Dad's age," Ethan would say with that concerned frown he'd perfected. "He's worried that Margaret might not understand the full implications of what she's asking him to go through." It was a lie, of course. Dr. Peterson had recommended the exact treatment plan Richard and I had chosen together, but Ethan had a gift for twisting medical terminology into weapons of doubt. Slowly, methodically, he began undermining Richard's confidence in my ability to be his advocate and partner. The real violation came 8 months into Richard's treatment, when I arrived home from a grocery run to find Ethan and Ashley in our home office, surrounded by open file cabinets and scattered papers. They had Richard's financial records spread across the desk, bank statements and investment portfolios arranged like they were conducting an audit. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded, dropping grocery bags in the doorway. Ashley looked up with that innocent expression she'd mastered, but Ethan met my anger head on. "We're helping Dad organize his affairs," he said coolly. "Someone needs to make sure his finances are in order, and frankly, Margaret, I don't think you're qualified to handle this level of complexity." I felt rage rise in my throat like bile, hot and acidic. "Get out," I said, proud that my voice stayed steady. "Both of you, now." "We're not going anywhere," Ethan said, standing up to his full height. At 28, he was 6 feet tall and used to intimidating people with his size. "This is my father's house, and these are my father's papers. You might be married to him, but you're not his real family." That phrase, real family, would haunt me for the next 6 months. It became their rallying cry, their justification for every boundary they crossed and every decision they tried to override. When Richard was hospitalized for pneumonia, they were the real family who should make medical decisions. When he was too weak to handle his own banking, they were the real family who should manage his finances. When he needed help with insurance forms, they were the real family who understood his best interests. I endured it because Richard asked me to, because he was fighting for his life and didn't have energy left over for fighting his son. But I also endured it because I knew something Ethan and Ashley didn't, something that made their territorial games ultimately meaningless. 3 months after his diagnosis, Richard had asked me to drive him to his lawyer's office alone. "There are some things I need to take care of," he'd said quietly. "Private things." I'd assumed he wanted to update his will to include me, maybe make sure I'd have enough to live on if he died first. What I didn't expect was for Richard to make me the sole beneficiary of everything: the house, the investments, the life insurance, even his collection of antique pocket watches that had been in his family for generations. "But Ethan," I'd protested, "he's your son." Richard had looked older than his 70 years that day, sitting in the lawyer's chair with the weight of hard decisions etched in every line of his face. "Ethan has never needed my money, because," he'd said finally. "He has his trust fund from his mother, his job, Ashley's family money, but more than that, Margaret, he's never appreciated what we have. He spent 7 years trying to undermine our marriage, waiting for me to die so he could push you out and take everything. I won't reward that behavior." The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Hendricks, who'd known Richard for 20 years, had nodded approvingly as she drafted the documents. "Smart man," she'd said to me after Richard signed everything. "I've seen too many second families left with nothing because the first family bullied the dying spouse into changing their will at the last minute. This way, everything's clear and legal, no matter what happens." I'd tucked that knowledge away like a secret weapon, never mentioning it to Richard again, never breathing a word to Ethan or Ashley. Let them make their plans and assume their inheritances. Let them treat me like a temporary inconvenience who'd be gone soon enough. They were building their hopes on quicksand, and I was content to wait and watch them sink. The end came faster than anyone expected. Richard had been stable for months, responding well to treatment, talking about taking a cruise when he felt stronger. Then, one Thursday morning in March, I woke up to find him unconscious beside me, barely breathing, his skin gray and cold. The paramedics worked on him for 20 minutes in our bedroom. That beautiful master bedroom where we'd spent so many peaceful mornings reading the paper together and planning our days. They got his heart beating again, got him breathing, but the damage was done. The cancer had spread to his brain, they told me at the hospital. Days, maybe a week. Ethan and Ashley arrived at the ICU within hours, both of them dressed in black like they'd been preparing for this midnight. They swept past me in the waiting room, Ashley carrying a folder of papers I recognized as the old will, the one from 15 years ago that left everything to Ethan. "We need to discuss arrangements," Ethan said, not bothering with pleasantries. "Dad's not going to recover from this, and there are decisions that need to be made by his real family." I was too exhausted to fight, too heartbroken to care about their posturing. Richard died 2 days later, holding my hand while Ethan and Ashley whispered in the corner about funeral homes and flower arrangements. He never regained consciousness, never got to say goodbye properly, just slipped away while I whispered that I loved him and that it was okay to go. The real Ethan emerged the moment his father's heart monitor flatlined. Before the doctor had even finished explaining about death certificates and next-of-kin procedures, Ethan was pulling me aside with the kind of authoritative grip he'd learned from Ashley's family business background. "Margaret, we need to talk about practical matters," he said, his voice already taking on the tone he'd use for the next week, patronizing patience mixed with barely concealed contempt. I know this is difficult, but Dad would want his affairs handled properly. I nodded numbly, still in shock, still processing the fact that Richard was gone and I was alone again after 7 years of partnership. I wasn't prepared for what came next. Obviously, I'll be handling the funeral arrangements, Ethan continued. Dad and I discussed this years ago before he got sick. He wanted a traditional service, nothing fancy, just close family and his real friends. There was that phrase again, real family. But this time it carried a different weight. This time it was a declaration of war. Ashley materialized beside him with that folder of papers, her expression appropriately somber, but with an undercurrent of excited energy that made my skin crawl. "We found Dad's will," she said softly, as if she were delivering comfort rather than a death blow. "From 2008, before you two met. It's all very clear about his intentions." I took the papers with shaking hands, too grief-stunned to process what they were really telling me. The document looked official enough, Richard's name, his address, what appeared to be his signature. It left everything to Ethan, with small bequests to a few charities, no mention of me anywhere. "I know this must be shocking," Ethan said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "but you have to understand, Margaret, this will represents Dad's true wishes, from before he got confused by illness and other influences." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. They were suggesting I'd manipulated a dying man into changing his will, that any document naming me as beneficiary would be the result of undue influence rather than genuine love. "Of course we're not heartless," Ashley added quickly. "We know Dad cared about you, and we want to make sure you're taken care of. We're prepared to let you stay in the house for a reasonable period while you make other arrangements. Maybe 6 months? That should be enough time to find somewhere more appropriate for your situation." The condescension in her voice finally penetrated my grief fog. More appropriate for my situation, as if being a widow made me somehow less deserving of the home I'd shared with my husband for 7 years, the home where I'd nursed him through cancer and held his hand through the darkest nights of treatment. "I'll need to see the original will," I managed to say, handing back their photocopy. "My lawyer will need to review everything before—" "Your lawyer?" Ethan interrupted, his mask of sympathy slipping for just a moment. "Margaret, I don't think you understand. This isn't complicated. Dad's will is clear, it's legal, and it's going to be probated exactly as written. You don't need a lawyer to tell you what's already been decided." But I did understand. Probably better than they realized. 7 years of working for Henderson and Associates had taught me exactly how estate law worked, had shown me dozens of cases where families fought over contested wills and suspicious document changes. I knew the difference between a legal will and a worthless piece of paper, and I was beginning to suspect which category their treasured document fell into. The next morning they arrived at my house, though they didn't know it yet, with a moving truck and enough relatives to constitute a small army. Ethan's aunts and uncles from his mother's side, Ashley's parents and brother, even some cousins I'd never met, all mobilized for what they clearly saw as a hostile takeover. I was still in my nightgown, still trying to process the fact that Richard was gone and I'd never see his face again, when they began carrying furniture out of my living room. "What are you doing, Sitz?" I demanded, running outside in my slippers and robe like some deranged bag lady. Ashley's mother, a sharp-faced woman named Linda, who'd always looked at me like I'd crawled out from under a rock, smiled with the kind of vicious satisfaction that comes from watching someone else's world collapse. "We're helping Ethan claim his inheritance, dear," she said sweetly. "These items have been in Richard's family for generations. They belong with his real family now. They were taking everything. Richard's leather armchair where he'd read his morning paper, the antique dining room set his grandmother had left him, even the wedding photos from our mantelpiece." I watched in numb horror as strangers handled our most intimate possessions, reducing 7 years of marriage to a pile of goods to be redistributed among the victors. "Stop," I said, but my voice came out as barely a whisper. "Please stop." Ethan emerged from the house carrying Richard's collection of pocket watches, the ones his great-grandfather had passed down through 4 generations of Blackwood men. "Sorry, Margaret," he said, not sounding sorry at all. "But these are family heirlooms. They need to stay in the family." I think that's when I finally understood what was happening, what they'd been planning probably since the day of Richard's diagnosis. This wasn't just about inheritance money or property ownership. This was about erasing me completely from Richard's life, removing any evidence that our marriage had mattered or that I'd been anything more than a temporary inconvenience in the Blackwood family narrative. The final blow came that afternoon when Ethan handed me an eviction notice typed on official letterhead from Ashley's family's law firm. 30 days, he said, his voice matter-of-fact as if he were discussing the weather. That's more than generous considering the circumstances. We could have demanded immediate possession, but we wanted to be fair. Fair. As if there was anything fair about being thrown out of my own home by people who'd spent 7 years pretending to tolerate my existence. The funeral is Thursday, Ashley added, consulting her phone like a social secretary. St. Mary's at 2 o'clock. We've already sent out the invitations, so everything's handled. I stared at her, not quite processing what she was saying. Invitations? Well, yes, she said, that syrupy tone back in full force. We had to be selective about the guest list. The church isn't very large, and we wanted to keep it intimate. Just close family and Richard's oldest friends. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Are you saying I'm not invited to my own husband's funeral? Ethan shifted uncomfortably, but Ashley met my eyes with the kind of cold satisfaction I'd seen in her face for 7 years. Margaret, I think it would be better for everyone if you said your goodbyes privately. The funeral is really for Richard's real family, the people who knew him before his judgment became compromised by illness. There it was again, the suggestion that Richard had been somehow mentally incompetent when he married me, that his love for me was a symptom of disease rather than a choice made by a healthy, intelligent man. You can't be serious, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I could see they were completely serious. In their minds, they'd already rewritten history, turned me into a gold-digging interloper who'd taken advantage of a vulnerable widower. It's for the best, Ethan said firmly. This way, everyone can focus on celebrating Dad's life without any awkwardness. I stood in my doorway, soon to be their doorway, watching them drive away in their convoy of vehicles, leaving me alone with the wreckage of my life. The house felt cavernous without Richard's presence, echoing with the absence of furniture they'd already claimed and memories they were trying to erase. That's when I called Patricia Hendricks. Margaret, she said, her voice warm with genuine sympathy. I heard about Richard. I'm so sorry for your loss. Patricia, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, I need you to tell me exactly what Richard's will says. There was a pause, and I could almost hear her mental wheels turning. Why? Has someone suggested otherwise? I told her everything. The old will Ethan and Ashley had produced, the eviction notice, the funeral ban, the systematic removal of everything Richard and I had built together. Patricia listened in increasingly outraged silence. Those idiots, she said finally, with the kind of professional disgust that comes from dealing with estate fraud for 30 years. Margaret, honey, that 2008 will was superseded the moment Richard signed his new will with me. It's not worth the paper it's printed on. Relief flooded through me like warm honey, followed immediately by something much sharper and more dangerous. So I own everything? Everything, Patricia confirmed. The house, the investments, the life insurance, even those pocket watches they took. Richard was very specific about his intentions, and we followed every legal requirement to make sure the will couldn't be contested. I sank into my kitchen chair, the one piece of furniture they'd left behind, probably because it didn't look valuable enough to steal, and felt something shift inside my chest. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it was joined now by a cold, clear anger that felt like stepping out of a fog into brilliant sunshine. What do I need to do? I asked. First, we file the real will for probate, Patricia said briskly. That establishes you as the legal owner of all assets. Then we deal with the theft charges. Theft charges? Margaret, they removed property that legally belongs to you without permission. That's theft, regardless of their intentions. We'll need to get everything back, and they'll be lucky if we don't press criminal charges. I thought about Ethan carrying away Richard's pocket watches, about Ashley's mother smiling while strangers hauled away our wedding photos, about the eviction notice that was supposed to make me homeless in 30 days. Press charges, I said quietly. Thursday morning dawned gray and cold, appropriate weather for a funeral I wasn't allowed to attend. I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee from Richard's favorite mug, one of the few personal items they'd overlooked in their pillaging, and watched cars drive past my house toward St. Mary's Church. Patricia arrived at 10 o'clock with a sheriff's deputy and a court order for the return of my property. Ready? She asked, and I could see the gleam of professional satisfaction in her eyes. Patricia had been practicing estate law for 30 years, and she'd never enjoyed anything more than watching greedy relatives get their comeuppance. More than ready, I said. We drove to the church in Patricia's car, arriving just as the funeral service was beginning. Through the stained glass windows, I could see the silhouettes of Ethan and Ashley in the front row, surrounded by all the real family members who'd helped them loot my house. The deputy knocked on the church doors, and I watched through the car window as the ushers scrambled to figure out what was happening. Finally, Ethan appeared in the doorway, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, keeping his voice low but not quite managing to hide his rage. "We're in the middle of a funeral service." Patricia stepped forward with the kind of professional composure that could cut glass. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm Patricia Hendricks, your father's attorney. I need to speak with you immediately about some items that were removed from Mrs. Blackwood's residence without authorization." I savored the look of confusion that crossed Ethan's face. "Mrs. Blackwood?" he repeated stupidly. "Margaret Blackwood," Patricia said clearly. "Your father's legal widow and the sole beneficiary of his estate." You could have heard a pin drop in the church vestibule. Ethan stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, while Ashley appeared behind him looking like someone had just told her the world was ending. "That's impossible," Ashley said, her voice rising to a near shriek. "We have Richard's will. From 2008, everything goes to Ethan." Patricia smiled with the kind of patience she might show to a particularly slow child. "Ms. Ashley, that 2008 will was superseded by a new will executed in 2019, 3 months after Richard's cancer diagnosis. The newer will is the only legally valid document, and it leaves everything to Margaret." I watched the color drain from Ethan's face as the implications hit him. Not only did he not inherit his father's estate, but he'd just stolen property belonging to someone else and was standing in front of a sheriff's deputy who could arrest him on the spot. "We didn't know," he said quickly, the words tumbling over each other. "We thought, the will we found, we just assumed." "You assumed wrong," the deputy said mildly. "Now, we can do this easy or we can do this hard, but all property removed from Mrs. Blackwood's residence needs to be returned immediately." Ashley made a sound like a dying animal. "But the funeral," she whispered. "Richard's funeral is happening right now." I stepped forward then, speaking for the first time since we'd arrived. "Yes, it is," I said quietly. "My husband's funeral, which I wasn't allowed to attend because I'm not real family." The look of horror on both their faces was worth 7 years of subtle insults and territorial games. They were finally understanding that their elaborate plan to erase me from Richard's life had backfired spectacularly, leaving them not only empty-handed, but potentially facing criminal charges. "We'll return everything," Ethan said desperately. "Right away. Today. Whatever you want." I looked at him for a long moment. This man-child who'd spent my entire marriage trying to undermine me, who'd banned me from my own husband's funeral, who'd planned to make me homeless within a month of becoming a widow. "No," I said simply. "You'll return everything when I'm ready to receive it. On my timeline, in my house, which, in case there's any confusion, belongs to me now." Patricia handed him a business card with the kind of sharp precision that suggested she'd done this 1,000 times before. "All property will be returned through legal channels with proper documentation and witnesses present. We'll be in touch about scheduling." As we walked back to the car, I could hear the commotion beginning inside the church as word spread through the congregation about what had just happened. By the time the funeral ended, everyone would know that Ethan Blackwood had been disinherited by his father and had tried to steal from his stepmother. The next few days passed in a blur of legal proceedings and returned property. Ethan and Ashley brought everything back in pieces, their earlier army of relatives nowhere to be seen now that the victory had turned into a humiliating defeat. Richard's pocket watches, our wedding photos, even the leather armchair where he'd read his morning paper, all of it came back to its rightful home. Ashley's mother, Linda, was notably absent from the return visits, and I learned later that she'd been the one advising them about estate law, apparently without bothering to check whether the will they'd found was actually valid. The whole family had built their plans on her expertise, and her expertise had turned out to be worth exactly nothing. The eviction notice, of course, went straight into the trash, along with the fake will and all the other papers they'd used to try to legitimize their takeover. Patricia had copies of everything filed with the court, establishing my ownership beyond any possible challenge. But the most satisfying moment came 2 weeks after the funeral, when I answered my doorbell to find Ethan standing on my porch, with a look of defeat that aged him 10 years. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I came to apologize." I looked at him through the screen door, this young man who'd made my life miserable for 7 years, who'd tried to steal my home and ban me from my husband's funeral. Part of me wanted to slam the door in his face and let him stand there like the beggar he'd become. Instead, I opened the door and stepped aside. "Come in." We sat in my living room, the same room where he'd questioned every financial decision Richard and I had made together, where Ashley had rearranged my belongings to show her dominance. Now it was just us, the widow and the disinherited son, dealing with the aftermath of his catastrophic miscalculation. "I thought I knew what Dad wanted," he said finally. "I thought he was just confused by the cancer treatment, making decisions he wouldn't normally make. I thought I was protecting his legacy." I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulative young man who'd spent years undermining my marriage. What I saw instead was someone who looked genuinely broken, forced to confront the fact that his father had chosen his wife over his son. "Your father wasn't confused," I said quietly. "He was hurt. For 7 years, you and Ashley treated me like an intruder in his life. You questioned his judgment, undermined his decisions, and made it clear that you were just waiting for him to die so you could get rid of me. He saw all of that, Ethan. He was disappointed in the man you'd become." Tears started running down Ethan's cheeks, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked younger than his 28 years. "I loved him," he whispered. "I know you did," I said, and I meant it. "But love isn't just a feeling, Ethan. It's how you treat people. It's respect and consideration and putting someone else's happiness before your own sometimes. You never learned to love your father the way he needed to be loved." We sat in silence for a while, both of us mourning different versions of the same man. Finally, Ethan wiped his eyes and looked at me directly. "What happens now?" he asked. I'd been thinking about that question for 2 weeks, weighing my options and considering what Richard would have wanted. I could destroy Ethan completely if I chose to, press theft charges, sue for emotional distress, make sure everyone in town knew exactly what kind of person he was. The legal system would back me up completely. But that wasn't what Richard would have wanted, and it wasn't who I wanted to be. "You and Ashley are going to disappear from my life," I said firmly. "No more surprise visits, no more helpful suggestions, no more family emergencies that require my immediate attention. You're going to let me grieve my husband and rebuild my life without your interference." He nodded quickly. "Of course. Absolutely. And if you ever speak about me the way you did during the funeral planning, suggesting that I manipulated your father, or that I'm not his real family, I will destroy you so completely that you'll wish I just had you arrested for theft." The steel in my voice surprised even me, but Ethan got the message. He nodded again, looking genuinely frightened for the first time in our relationship. "But," I continued, "I'm not going to press charges, and I'm not going to ruin your reputation over this. You're going to have to live with what you did for the rest of your life, and that's punishment enough." After he left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by all the possessions he and Ashley had tried to steal, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: complete peace. The house was quiet but not empty, filled with memories of Richard that no one could take away from me. I kept some of Richard's things and donated others to charity, including most of his clothes and books, but I kept his pocket watches, the ones Ethan had been so sure he'd inherit. They sit on my mantelpiece now, next to our wedding photo and a picture of Richard in his garden, tending the gardenias he used to bring me. 3 months later, I learned that Ethan and Ashley had broken up, their relationship crumbling under the weight of their failed scheme and mutual recriminations. Apparently, Ashley had been furious that Ethan hadn't known about his father's real will, while Ethan blamed Ashley's family for giving them bad legal advice. When the inheritance they'd been counting on evaporated, so did their grand plans for the future. Ashley moved back in with her parents, taking her breathy manipulation and territorial instincts with her. Ethan, from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, was forced to get a real job for the first time in his adult life, his mother's trust fund apparently not quite as generous as he'd always assumed. I felt a twinge of something that might have been pity, but mostly I felt relief. Richard had been right to cut them out of his will. They'd shown their true colors the moment they thought he couldn't stop them, and they'd have spent any inheritance he left them without a second thought for the man who'd provided it. The house settled into new rhythms without the constant undercurrent of tension that had defined the Ethan and Ashley years. I hired a gardener to maintain Richard's rose bushes and vegetable patch, Not because I couldn't do it myself, but because I wanted to honor his memory by keeping the things he'd loved beautiful and thriving. I also started volunteering at the senior center, helping other widows navigate the legal and financial maze that comes with losing a spouse. Too many of them had stories like mine, adult children or stepchildren who saw their parents' death as a financial opportunity, families who turned vicious the moment inheritance was on the table. The thing people don't understand, I told one woman whose daughter-in-law was trying to have her declared incompetent so she could control her assets, is that a will isn't just a legal document. It's a final statement about what you valued and who you trusted. When someone tries to override those wishes, they're not just stealing money, they're stealing dignity. Patricia Hendricks became not just my lawyer, but a genuine friend, someone who understood the particular brand of betrayal that comes from family members who mistake love for weakness. We had lunch every few weeks, sharing war stories from the estate law trenches and marveling at the creativity people showed when it came to justifying their greed. The ones who get to me, she said over coffee one afternoon, are the ones like Ethan. They genuinely believe they're entitled to everything just because they're blood relatives. It never occurs to them that inheritance has to be earned through love and respect. I thought about that conversation often in the months that followed, as I slowly transformed the house from Richard's house where I lived to my house where Richard's memory lived too. I repainted the bedroom in colors that made me happy, rearranged the living room furniture to better catch the morning sun, and turned Richard's old office into a reading room filled with books and comfortable chairs. The most satisfying change was the garden. Richard had always kept it perfectly manicured, every plant in its designated space, every flower bed symmetrical and controlled. I let it grow wilder, adding native plants that attracted butterflies and birds, creating the kind of English cottage garden chaos that Richard had always resisted, but that made me feel completely at peace. 6 months after the funeral, I received an unexpected visitor. I was deadheading roses when I looked up to see a young woman standing at my garden gate, clearly nervous but trying to project confidence. "Mrs. Blackwood?" she said hesitantly. "I'm Jennifer, Ethan's cousin from his mother's side. Could I speak with you for a moment?" I recognized her vaguely. She'd been one of the relatives helping to move furniture during the great looting of my house. But unlike the others, she looked genuinely uncomfortable rather than righteously triumphant. "What can I do for you, Jennifer?" I asked, not bothering to hide my wariness. She twisted her hands nervously, clearly rehearsing words she'd practiced. "I came to apologize," she said finally, "for what happened at the funeral and with the house and everything. I didn't know about the real will, and I should have asked more questions instead of just going along with what Ethan said." I studied her face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. What I saw was a young woman genuinely wrestling with the knowledge that she'd participated in something cruel and wrong. "Ethan told us you were trying to steal Mr. Blackwood's inheritance," she continued. "He said you'd manipulated him when he was sick, that the family needed to protect his real wishes. We believed him because we wanted to believe him." "And now?" I asked. Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "Now I know we were horrible to you. Mr. Blackwood loved you. Anyone who spent 5 minutes with you both could see that. And we treated you like you were some kind of criminal instead of his grieving widow." I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot of anger I hadn't even realized I was carrying. "Thank you," I said simply. "That means more than you know." She nodded and turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at me. "Mrs. Blackwood, I know this doesn't fix anything, but I want you to know that what happened changed how I think about family. Real family isn't just blood, it's how you treat each other. Mr. Blackwood knew that, and he chose you because you understood it too." After she left, I sat in my garden surrounded by the controlled chaos of my new landscaping and felt something I hadn't experienced since Richard's diagnosis. Hope for the future. Not just my future, but the possibility that good people could learn from bad situations, that families could heal from the damage done by greed and entitlement. That evening, I called my stepdaughter from my first marriage, Frederick's daughter Lisa, who lived in California with her own family. Lisa and I had maintained a warm relationship through all the years of my marriage to Richard, and she'd been horrified when I told her about Ethan and Ashley's behavior. "How are you holding up?" she asked, her voice warm with genuine concern. "Better," I said, and realized I meant it. "I think I'm finally ready to start thinking about what comes next." "Good," Lisa said firmly. "You've spent enough time dealing with other people's selfishness. Time to focus on yourself." We talked for an hour about everything and nothing: her kids' school activities, my volunteer work, the book club I joined at the library. Normal conversation between two people who cared about each other, without any underlying agenda or manipulation. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of the wine Richard and I used to share on Friday evenings and sat on the porch swing he'd installed for our 5th anniversary. The house was quiet around me, but it was the good kind of quiet, peaceful rather than empty. I thought about all the ways my life could have gone differently if I'd been weaker, if I hadn't had Patricia's legal expertise, if Richard hadn't been wise enough to protect me with his will. I could have been homeless, penniless, reduced to whatever mercy Ethan and Ashley chose to show me. Instead, I was sitting in my own home, financially secure, surrounded by memories of a man who'd loved me enough to ensure I'd be taken care of after he was gone. Richard's final gift hadn't just been the house and money, it had been the knowledge that I was valued, that our marriage had mattered, that I deserved to be protected and cherished. The irony wasn't lost on me that Ethan and Ashley's greed had ultimately revealed the depth of Richard's love. If they'd been kinder, if they'd treated me with basic human decency, I might never have known how carefully Richard had planned for my future. Their cruelty had exposed his generosity, their selfishness had highlighted his wisdom. A year later, I was planting bulbs for spring when I saw a familiar car pull up to the curb. Ethan got out slowly, looking older and more tired than when I'd last seen him. He approached my garden gate with the hesitant steps of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome. "Hello, Margaret," he said quietly. I straightened up from my planting, brushing dirt off my gardening gloves. "Ethan." He stood there for a long moment, clearly struggling with what he wanted to say. Finally, he pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I wrote you a letter," he said. "A real apology, not just words. I wanted to explain, I wanted to try to explain why I did what I did, and to tell you I understand now why Dad chose you." I took the envelope but didn't open it. "And why did he choose me?" Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper. "Because you loved him without wanting anything from him. Because you made him happy in a way I never bothered to notice. Because you were his partner, not his burden." The simple truth of it hung between us in my garden, surrounded by the flowers Richard had planted and the ones I'd added since his death. For the first time in our entire relationship, Ethan was seeing me clearly, not as a threat to his inheritance or an obstacle to his plans, but as a woman who'd loved his father and been loved in return. "I'm glad you understand that now," I said gently. He nodded, tears making tracks down his face. "I know I can't undo what I did, and I know you don't owe me forgiveness, but I wanted you to know that I see you now. Really see you, and I'm sorry it took losing everything for me to figure out what Dad already knew." After he left, I sat on my porch swing and read his letter. It was 6 pages long, handwritten, full of the kind of brutal self-examination that only comes from having your entire worldview collapse. He wrote about his jealousy, his entitlement, his fear that loving me meant betraying his mother's memory. He wrote about Ashley's influence and his own weakness in following her lead, rather than thinking for himself. But mostly, he wrote about his father, memories of Richard that I'd never heard before, stories from Ethan's childhood that painted a picture of a man who'd always put his son's needs before his own, who'd sacrificed and worried and hoped for a relationship that Ethan had taken completely for granted. "I thought love meant getting everything I wanted," he wrote in his careful script. "I didn't understand that love means wanting someone else to be happy, even when it costs you something. You understood that about Dad, and he understood it about you. That's why you belong together, and that's why he trusted you with his legacy." I folded the letter carefully and put it in the box where I kept Richard's important papers. Someday, maybe, Ethan and I could have a real relationship built on mutual respect and genuine affection. But that day was still in the future, and I wasn't in any hurry to get there. For now, it was enough to know that Richard's love story had a proper ending, not the fairy tale romance of living happily ever after, but the deeper satisfaction of being truly known and valued by another human being. He'd protected me in death as thoroughly as he'd cherished me in life, and that protection had given me the space to grieve properly and rebuild myself into someone stronger and wiser than I'd ever been. As I sat in my garden watching the sunset behind the roses, I raised my glass of wine in a silent toast to my husband. "Thank you," I whispered to the gathering dusk, "for choosing me, for protecting me, and for showing me what real family looks like." The flowers nodded in the evening breeze, and for just a moment I could swear I felt Richard's hand squeeze mine the way he used to when we sat together on the same porch swing, planning our days and dreaming our dreams. I was alone now, but I wasn't lonely. I was free. Free from Ethan and Ashley's manipulation. Free from their judgment and territorial games. Free to honor Richard's memory in my own way and build whatever future felt right to me. And that freedom, I realized as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, was the greatest gift of all.